technical issues worked out. And I'll introduce Lee Bishop, who's going to do the presentation here for you.
Okay, well, hello everybody, or good evening everybody. This basically is an extension of an article I did in the October-November 2022 issue of O-Gauge Railroading about Army railroads, focusing mostly on the Second World War, but I'll be speaking about other time periods and such. So I'm just going to have a few slides at the very beginning with some concepts I'm going to go over. Don't worry, the whole slideshow won't be that. The rest of it will be actual legit photographs. So, okay, so that's me on the right. When I do this presentation at NMRA convention, I might actually walk in dressed like this. Of course, not with the M1 carbine. I think they take a dim view of that, but it's all accurate. Historically correct, and most of it's original. So, okay, so the use of railroads in wartime goes back to one of the many wars that the Germans and the French fought with each other in the 19th century. But the primary main use that the American military got out of it was during the Civil War. Matter of fact, the Confederate rapid response to getting troops to the Battle of Manassas, the very first land battle during the Civil War, was one of the primary reasons why they dominated in that particular battle. They got there first with the most people. Throughout the war in the East and somewhat in the West, of course we refer to that as the Midwest, but they were fighting over the use of railroads constantly throughout the war. Jeb Stuart, Stoneman on the Union side would routinely go into railroads and tear them up to deny the enemy the use of the railroads. But getting troops around actually spelled victory in several key battles in the Civil War, and that was not lost upon the U.S. military. So fast forward through the next conflict, which is the Spanish-American War, getting troops mostly trained up in the north, the extreme northeast corner of the United States down to Tampa, so the troops could get down to ports of embarkation to get down to Cuba to fight the Spaniards. That actually meant a great deal. The war would have been over by the time Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders would have actually gotten to Cuba had they not been able to use trains. But in World War I, at this point, it was a national effort. You could have troops being trained here in Fort Lewis, shipped across the country in just a few days to ports of embarkation in New York, mostly shipped to France. So you could be training here in the Pacific Northwest and actually be in France within 2 or 3 weeks of that time period. It takes several days cross country back in those days, but still is much faster than any time period before. First World War actually saw a great use of railroads on the front lines as well, getting munitions and men and material and weapons to the front lines. They had a lot of narrow gauge, meter gauge railroads off of the main line, standard gauge stuff that the French were running well behind the front lines. To get trains so close to the trenches, they actually used a lot of gas mechanical locomotives to where the smoke wouldn't set off German artillery response. But the primary effort in railroading for military history certainly has to rest in the 1940s. Basically, you have a global war, actual real global war. Same deal as before, but things were moving an awful lot faster. So we were fighting on 2 fronts. Didn't really matter where you were getting trained at, whether you had to go to the Pacific or go to Europe. Trains could actually get you there relatively fast. And then at that point, we were actually utilizing a lot of railroads in formerly occupied countries and friendly nations, mostly England, places of that nature. We ran a vast network of railroad units running British trains, and British crews running American military trains in England, even with locomotives supplied by the U.S. Army. I'll go over that, show you a couple of pictures of that in a little bit. One could even argue one of the many reasons why Germany lost World War II was that they actually utilized their railroad network to the Holocaust, and that actually prevented them from being able to prosecute the war against especially the Soviets. The besides being a truly sadistic and insane thing, logistically it was pretty stupid because they couldn't utilize a lot of trains to getting men and material around because they were so busy trying to do things that actually were contrary to their involvement in the war. But anyway, after the war, we actually had to rebuild railroad networks all over Asia and Europe, provided vast amounts of rolling stock locomotives, which were built exclusively for that purpose, export locomotives, and the British did too. So after that, we actually were involved in Korea for the same reason, moving people around the United States. And you're talking about a relatively fixed war in one spot. And that actually helped with that particular war as well. We left a lot of equipment over there, but that was intentional. Every time we fought a war up until the 1950s, we would leave all the equipment in place. And World War II and Korean War era stuff is actually still being run all over the world to this day. Some U.S. Army locomotives have been restored in the U.K. A few are actually still running small for small places like factories and whatnot in Eastern Europe and places of that nature. Today, it's very different. The railway units during the Second World War, the railway operating battalions they sent out are pretty much done. There's only 2 that I'm aware of, railway operating units. They're both reserve units now. Interior railway operations in what was in 1940s referred to as the zone in the interior, we call it CONUS, Continental United States now, mostly operated by civilian contractors. So we no longer have that that concerted military effort that we did back then. That's not to say we couldn't pick that ball up and run with it if necessary. We actually operate a lot of military equipment, railway equipment in the Iraq war. Afghanistan is traditionally not known as a railroad-oriented place. You couldn't possibly build railroads into the Hindu Kush and some of those places of that nature. But in Iraq, there were a lot of Army railroaders running around. Now, in World War II, railway operating battalions were actually broke down in individual companies, normally commanded by either a first lieutenant or a captain. Headquarters company ran administrative functions. A company ran the trains themselves, dispatching. B company ran maintenance aspects of it. And the other companies handled things like maintenance of way. And if you had a D company, if I remember correctly, that actually ran electrical operations if you're running electrified railroads, but that obviously wasn't used very much. And those units were sponsored by civilian railroads, manned by mostly former civilian railroaders and who went into uniform. And okay, so they would be sponsored, that is, by civilian railroads. And I explained the structure of a railway operating battalion. Now, how to apply this to a railway operating battalion on a layout is interesting because you can set them up in a roundhouse. You can set them up in a dispatch area, some sandbag emplacements for just training purposes, bunch of jeeps, vehicles, some GI figures running around, some loose Army equipment. There would be locomotives and freight cars in some cases. Now, in a lot of cases, they ran the civilian stuff. They would come into a railroad, they take over a roundhouse completely, teach their civilian railroaders how to do it the military way. They were used to rules, so the transition wasn't that tough. And then there's the concept of stateside versus foreign operations. So stateside would be you would be running trains internally, troop trains from the ports of embarkation, trains on captive railroad lines, say in around an arsenal, where they wouldn't leave the grounds to make it to a main line. Foreign operations, though, all bets were off. The painting at the bottom of the slide is actually a couple of EMD MRS-1 locomotives in Iran. There was a vast amount of U.S. Army Railroad stock actually sent to the Middle East as part of our effort to get equipment and lend-lease to the Russians. And they would run everywhere. They'd run as far from the swamps in New Guinea or places, tiny little outposts in the Pacific. Some unit could easily be running narrow gauge rack and pinion lines up to Zugspitze in Germany at the end of the war. You name it, they ran trains on it. Europe, of course, at that time was completely covered in railroad lines, and had to undo a lot of the bomb damage that we inflicted upon railroads, because railroad yards were primary strategic targets by bombing raids in World War II. And you'd have the resistance, especially in France and occupied Europe. You'd have to clean up their messes, but that's what they were there for. They understood that, and they just had to cope with it. So operations of trains, like I said, you got captive lines, which never went anywhere. That would be narrow gauge lines that actually ran around arsenals, moving munitions around. They would interchange. Someplace like an ordnance depot. It had places called igloos, that basically bunkers covered with dirt, concrete enclosures on both sides, big giant metal door filled full of munitions, anything from chemical weapons to high explosive. If one of them blows up, it doesn't set off the rest of them. In a lot of cases, there would be roads connecting the two of them, but in a lot of cases, you'd have narrow gauge railroads or even standard gauge connecting those together. Quartermaster depots, very common. We had a really big one here in the Pacific Northwest, a Mount Rainier Ordnance Depot, which is now the maintenance center on Fort Lewis, and that had a vast railroad network on it as well. Just moving equipment around like you would in the civilian concept. You would just be moving equipment around to individual buildings, getting where it needs to go. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be an Army concept. You could run railroads that were dedicated to airfield or even port operations. So you could have Air Corps or Air Force or Navy operations later. And in fact, in the 1960s, Eglin Air Force Base in Florida actually had steam locomotives connected to winches running along tracks to be used as aerial targets by jet fighters. That would make one heck of a feature on a model railroad layout, I would think. So what they would do, the reason why the military would even run trains in the first place, a railroad unit would get together. They would familiarize the Army railroaders. There's a sergeant, a technical sergeant on the right. Now, if you notice, he's wearing a little button-looking thing on his chest. That's actually a round device about 3 inches across, made out of chrome steel, and it would actually identify the person by what their job is. Now, I have a photograph of one in a later slide, so don't worry about that. But in stateside, they would wear those. And there's not a lot of photographs of those being used, and they're very hard to find today. Most people don't know what they are when they run across them. But that way, you'd be able to walk up to this gentleman and tell what his role is. His badge probably said fireman. And so you'd be running troop trains, moving heavy equipment around with inside or between training bases and ports. Really common around here on the main line to be seeing equipment moving back and forth between Fort Lewis, the National Guard base down in Oregon near Astoria. So the trains were always moving around, moving equipment around. The locomotives and the cars were, in some cases, like I said earlier, as in this photograph, he's actually oiling a Southern 280, if I remember correctly. They would be running civilian railroad equipment at first until they got to where they were going, and they would take possession of U.S. Army equipment. And they would bring a lot of freight cars with them because where they were going, a lot of stuff was actually damaged by bombing and shelling and resistance operations, denying the enemy, phrase we use in the military a lot. And along with that, you could model things like vehicles, jeeps, trucks, even larger vehicles, even half tracks would be used in some cases. The vehicles, the armored vehicles that have tank tracks in the back, conventional wheels in the front, those were used for all kinds of reasons as well. Not necessarily combat related as such, although these soldiers were definitely armed because they'd be alone in a lot of circumstances. But it's a great modeling opportunity because, to be blunt, in HO scale, everything is modeled. So you can get anything in HO scale. Trust me, you can get all the military vehicles you could possibly ever want. You can even throw a couple of German vehicles onto the back of your flat cars to be taken home for war souvenirs. And so with the vehicles, though, two particular things that drive me nuts when I see people modeling stateside equipment in World War II. You have markings on a lot of models that are actually European theater or ETO oriented, a star with a surround on it. That was only used in the European theater. It wasn't used anywhere else. It wasn't used after World War II. You would not see that in the United States. If a unit was getting prepared to go to Europe, that stuff would be put on the vehicle once it got to England or France. So the markings in the stateside would be very different from that what you find on a lot of commercial models. So in other words, you'll see from slides in a little bit, I've actually had to strip a lot of these models down and completely rebuild, repaint them and remark them. And a second thing that I don't have a bullet comment for is the one thing which will drive a veteran such as myself completely unadulteratedly out of their mind is putting a tank on a flat car with machine guns in place. Because anyone who's ever served can tell you it'll take about 5 seconds to take a 50 caliber machine gun off the mounts off of the tank. And all you got to do is throw it over the side. Well, take a guess what happens when the tank gets to where it's supposed to go and the machine guns are missing on it. Sarge isn't going to take that very likely. He's going to take it lightly, that is, and you'll be peeling potatoes for the duration. And you'll get volunteered for every time they need somebody to walk up front and see if the enemy is there. And post-war operations as well doesn't have to take place in the Second World War. Keep in mind, a lot of people like modeling the transition area in this time frame. So you have the Korean War. A lot of World War II equipment was used in the Korean War. Shermans, later model Shermans that were used in European theater at the very end of the war would have plentifully been used in Korea. World War II Jeeps, trucks, things of that nature, all very common to be used up until the 1950s or 1960s. And on top of this, you actually have the Fort Eustis Railroad in Virginia, which was actually used to train soldiers how to operate trains the Army way. They were running steam locomotives as late as the late 1960s because they were encountering steam engines in other countries. So they were teaching soldiers how to run anything that they got their hands on. So they were like one of the last places to actually stop using steam. I believe they were running steam up until about 65 or 68. I don't remember the exact year. So this is an excellent example of the use of railroads in the Civil War. This is a U.S. military railroad, 440. All recognize the type. They were used in great numbers. U.S. military railroad had a tremendous amount of railroad equipment because they couldn't count on civilian railroads actually having everything in place because the opposing sides would often derail trains, blow them up, things of that nature. Blowing up track was not very common. That was more something you saw in the Second World War because explosives you could carry around weren't all that terribly plentiful because usually the only explosive material anybody had in the Civil War was gunpowder, and it's really tough to make a high explosive out of that. So what they would do is they would yank the rails off. They would actually bend them around. They would heat them over a fire and actually bend them around trees to where they couldn't possibly be used again. So both sides got really good at it. Stewart on the Confederate side and Stoneman on the Union side were particularly adept at destroying railroads. But the U.S. military had a tremendous amount of railroad equipment during the American Civil War. Okay, so we're fast forwarding here quite a bit, but this locomotive on the right is actually a Baldwin class, actually is a Davenport copy of a Baldwin Class 10 trench engine, a 262T. It's a perfect copy of the Baldwin design, which was used in Europe quite a bit, in France during the First World War. This, however, was used on the Fort Benning Railroad, as pretty obviously noted on the bottom right-hand corner. This photograph was probably taken right before the beginning of World War II by observing the clothing on the individuals on the left. Some of these uniform types would not be worn like that later on. So this particular line was run by the quartermaster. You can barely see it on the side tanks, QMC USA, Quartermaster Corps, United States Army, in a single-digit serial number. Now, one of these locomotives still exists today. I'll show some photographs of that as well. This line was actually used for taking troops around the various cantonment areas and down to the rifle ranges. It was used quite a bit, had many, many locomotives, and they only abandoned that up until after World War II was over with. But it gives you an idea of the equipment that they primarily used in the First World War. This locomotive would have looked perfectly at home about a mile or two behind the behind the trenches at places like Chateau Thierry. So this is the primary thing that you would see railroads doing in the Second World War. Here you have what to me, I think this is a Santa Fe train. Somebody will probably tell me maybe it's Southern Pacific instead. I don't know. But anyway, clearly in the Southwest. Now, if you notice the Jeeps in the foreground, he doesn't have any 5-gallon water or gas cans or jerry cans in the bracket to the left of the spare tire. Probably won't have a shovel or axe on the driver's side underneath the opening. And notice the canvas covers over the windshields. That is an excellent reminder of how you should really model a Jeep loaded. And notice it's tied down, and he's got wheel chocks, pretty extensive ones, considering a Jeep only weighs about 2,300 pounds. That Jeep ain't going anywhere with a wheel chock that looks like it's at least 8 inches tall. And notice it's actually tied down with rope. It's not even tied down with chain. It probably should be chained down, but it gives you an idea. And beyond the second Jeep in front, there's actually a trailer as well. And notice that's covered as well. The covers on these windshields were actually to be placed on them whenever they're in the down position to protect the windshields and also to keep light from being reflected off of them. They actually had little canvas covers for the headlights to where light wouldn't reflect off of those as well. And in combat, this stuff would be used all the time. Now here we have an excellent photograph of a landing ship tank or LST being offloaded somewhere in Europe. The reason why I know for sure that it's Europe, the gentleman to the far, looks like African American, to the far left, the white stripe on the back of his helmet, he was actually a non-commissioned officer in a European theater. If he was an officer, that stripe would be vertical, and they only did that in Europe. But you can see the cars, these European style gondolas are marked Transportation Corps, United States Army. And they were being offloaded, and offloading off of an LST was a very common way to do it because the size of it was just right, just the perfect width for railroad equipment. It's tall enough to put a boxcar in there if you have to. I'm not sure if locomotives actually came across like this. I've never found a photograph of the locomotive actually being offloaded in this manner, but I've seen plenty of photographs of freight cars being offloaded. And here we have another photograph. I can't tell you where this is because there's nothing but sailors around. Sailors dress pretty much the same all the way around. However, the individual on the left would lead me to believe this is either in the Mediterranean, more than likely. He's wearing a summer weight uniform. You wouldn't see that in Europe, probably. He wouldn't have been issued that there. So this could actually be southern France or maybe even Italy. But again, notice it's a European style car with USA markings. Same operation as before. The ramp that they have for the railroads, I mean, you can clearly tell it's much better built than the previous slide. And obviously the sailors, this must be the first car off of the boat because the sailors really are interested in what's going on. These kind of photographs, you rarely see people watching the operation too much. Now, attached to freight cars, this is like a collector sidebar here. Every freight car had a plate on it. Not necessarily the builder's plate, but the acceptance plate. This is in my collection. This is off of a 100, tare weight's 19 tons, but the capacity is 56 tons. So relatively small, probably a 2-axle short car. This actually was extracted off of a flat car at Orléans, Belgium, sometime in the 1990s. I'm not going to go into how I got it. Suffice to say that the car was rotting away, so I considered it kind of kindness. Now, here we get into how do I know all this stuff? Well, I collect all these things and I read all these books. So this shows you some of the field manuals that are available in the collector's market to this day. There's Military Railroads, Military Railway Service. The second one to the bottom left is the Railway Operating Battalion Manual. These manuals really aren't terribly long. They're only like 30, 40 pages. They don't take very long to read because these guys were all civilian railroaders. Most of them were. You didn't get drafted in this line of work. If you were a railroader, you started doing this stuff. So most of the people who went into this kind of duty already knew how to run trains. Now, bottom left-hand corner, those are the badges I'm talking about. So they're roughly about 3.5 inches around. These are the only two I've ever actually seen. I've never seen in any other collections. I have one that's marked agent and the other one is marked conductor. USA at the top for United States Army, MRS at the bottom for military railway service. There's not a lot written on. Matter of fact, there's nothing written on these things. Had I not been able to find a couple photographs of them being worn, I would be absolutely sure that they were used in World War II. But I've confirmed that one of the railway operating battalions, the Southern Railroad, sponsored. I've seen 3 photographs of a sequence where they're wearing them. And above, upper left-hand corner, you have the equipment data book used in Europe, which was marked restricted at the bottom. It's not top secret, but you weren't supposed to let the civilians get their hands on this. Basically, all it is side views of locomotives and equipment, showing the size and the capacity. That way you can kind of get an idea before you actually got your hands on them. More of an illustrational guide, more than likely before you actually got into a railroad yard in France, but it mainly is European oriented. And then to the right of that, there was a series of maps made for all the railroads in Europe. Section 9 actually covers the lines actually leaving the Normandy sector. I would love to have gotten my hands on the one that would actually be the Normandy landing beaches, but this is the one immediately east of that one, so I was lucky to get that one. Below that is a guide of French railroads, French rolling stock, which was actually printed by the British 12th Army Group. Excuse me. And that's an interesting guide as well. It's used by American railroaders. In the upper right-hand corner is the safety rules for railroads printed by the Ordnance Department. So that gives you an idea about moving things around, handling munitions, captive lines of that sort we were talking about earlier. And in the lower right-hand corner was a French railroad guide pilfered by a GI from, would have been used by the Germans because it was printed in 1943. So here we have an excellent example of what I believe is an S160 Series 280. We sent hundreds of these locomotives all over the world, some of them still in operation. Excuse me. And if you notice the chalk markings on the tender, Berlin bound, it's actually really common. You see all kinds of slogans of that nature. This is probably taken in France, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I don't profess to be an expert on the construction of rails and ties in England, but it just doesn't look right to me. So my money would be on probably taken somewhere in France. And here we have a couple of other plates post-war. Again, all military equipment all has plates marked on. The one above is of 150-ton depressed center flat car, and it's aluminum plate. And the one below that is a steel plate for, if you've ever remember seeing the tiny little DDT series diesel switcher models from companies like Model Power, you've now seen a plate that actually was attached to one. This is actually from a DDT series switcher, locomotive number 5754, built in 1953. Never seen another one of these plates. Managed to find this on eBay, but it gives you an idea that Army equipment all had plates of this nature. That's not a builder's plate. That's actually the plate, the acceptance plate for the military application. All Army rolling stock had something of that nature. So here we have an actual Army locomotive. This is at the museum at Snoqualmie. And it's I forget the model, but it gives you an idea. There's these locomotives were used post-war. This would have been from the 1950s. I don't remember the history of this. I thought I was going to write it down where I could be able to recite it. But a lot of these locomotives still survive today. A lot of them, matter of fact, a few are actually still in use in the United States in various places. But this gives you an idea of what you would see post-war. So you could use locomotives like this. After World War II, a locomotive of this nature would be painted black, would have a transportation corps insignia stenciled in white on side, put U.S. Army on it. Before that, and in the Second World War, diesels would have been painted either yellow, gray, or OD green, or black. Now, a lot of model manufacturers like to put steam locomotives and make them OD green. It never happened. It's one of those things the manufacturers like to do. Now, these small Davenport and Baldwin locomotives, the little trench engines, actually were delivered to the U.S. military. Some of them were delivered in a very light OD green. That was something just recently discovered on a surviving locomotive. When they stripped the paint, they actually found the actual first coat was a very light OD green, which came as a heck of a shock to everybody. But conventional normal steam locomotives in the First and the Second World War were not painted OD green. Why that? Why manufacturers make them that way? I don't know. They think it looks cool, I suppose. Now here we have an excellent example of what I was referring to earlier. This locomotive actually came from Fort Eustis, Virginia, and went all the way out to Utah for the 100th anniversary of the Golden Spike. So I had an entire Army train that went along with it. And if you notice on the tender, you can barely read it. It says from the Virginia Peninsula to the state of Utah. So this is number 612, 600 series locomotives. It's the same type of locomotives as the one I showed you earlier, the one that I thought was taken in France. Same class locomotive. This shows you how they were painted post-war. They were actually painted, you see all the yellow to it. That's a post-war thing. You see that in the 50s and 60s. The problem is a lot of these books on the subject have a lot of photographs of the Fort Eustis Railroad, which are taken in the 50s and 60s. So that kind of throws people off. It's kind of hard to tell how things were painted. You really have to get good at looking at the uniforms and a lot of those photographs to tell when they were actually taken, because this locomotive was built in the 1940s. So if you're familiar with the uniforms, you can tell when the picture was taken and how it was painted. So this shows the primary role of what railroads do today. Now, I took this photograph in Tenino. This is a line of Bradley fighting vehicles, and the nearest three vehicles to the far right in desert colors are painted. Those are Humvees, the vehicle that replaced the Jeep in the 1980s. This is a train headed to Fort Lewis, probably coming back from the war game exercise down in Fort Irwin, California, the National Training Center. So seeing vehicle movements of this nature, because this is the only way you can move tracked vehicles around the United States. You can't put them on 18-wheelers. They can't carry something that weighs that much. And there's not enough lowboys in the world to move an armored brigade around like this. So trains is the only option. Now, some of these cars are just regular conventional flat cars, but the Department of Defense does have a substantial fleet of cars of that nature. So you'll see them painted OD green, and the reporting marks are DODX. Now, there'll be no military locomotives on this run. The locomotives will be standard for just standard civilian freight locomotives. That's conventional movements you see today. Okay, so we're going to show some museum shots here. Now, if you remember the earlier photograph I showed you of the Davenport copies of the Baldwin Class 10 262s, here's the only preserved example from the Fort Benning Railroad. The rest of them were actually scrapped.
Main run goes all the way back.
Yeah. So if you notice, it has European-style couplers to it. The caboose, if you want to call it that, coupled to it is kind of a home-built thing. It's meter gauge, so I think it's like 600 millimeters, if I remember correctly. So it's about 2 foot, give or take. Notice the pile generator behind the headlight to actually generate power. They didn't come that way originally. They wouldn't have had generators during the First World War, but they clearly would have had them by about the 1940s, so they can run electric lights on them. Now, the museum at Fort Benning, unfortunately, did what a lot of model manufacturers like to do, like to paint the stupid thing OD green. It was never painted that color. Ironically, the sign sitting in front of it at the National Infantry Museum shows all the photographs of locomotives taken at Fort Benning. Not one of them is painted like this. You'd think they take the cue from that. They were all painted black, but the markings are pretty good. But if you ever go to Fort Benning, Georgia, find yourself in the Columbus, Georgia area, this is actually behind the National Infantry Museum. So even if the museum is closed, you'll be able to walk around the back of the building. It's sitting out in the open with no fence around it. Now, the fence next to that is actually all their World War II buildings that they had moved from various locations on the post. That's enclosed. You can only go there on a guided tour. This you can walk up to. So if you ever find yourself in the Columbus, Georgia area, you can go right up to that, because this part of the base is not actually closed to the public. So there's no gate to go through. You can just drive right up to it. Now, probably the best collection of U.S. Army railroad equipment anywhere in the world is at Fort Eustis, Virginia. The Transportation Corps is no longer housed there. However, they can't move all this stuff. So the Transportation Museum is still there at Fort Eustis. This is a Army boxcar, obviously, the same class that you would have seen offloaded off of one of the LSTs in one of the earlier photographs. It's pretty clear what it is. European prototype. Notice where the brake wheel is immediately next to the front axle, the axle closest to us. And it is correctly painted up in Army colors. Although I do believe the stenciling is a little more professional than you probably would have seen back then. This is a narrow gauge locomotive. This was used in Europe, if I remember correctly. But again, if you notice, it's got the post-war markings all over it, all the yellow, the high visibility stuff, things to grab onto. You would not have seen that locomotive painted like that during the Second World War. And there's the back of the same locomotive. I'm not too sure about the number on it. I've never seen another locomotive had a letter designation in the number. I've never seen one anywhere, so I'm not sure what the story behind that was. The People Museum couldn't tell me. And here we have another locomotive, same class as the one I showed the previous photographs. The one I think was in France and the one taken in Utah. It's the same class. And this was run around Fort Eustis. My understanding, it was one of the last locomotives to run in the 1960s. It's the only one they have on the property now, is my understanding. Near a very interesting caboose. This was actually used in Europe. Anyone familiar with European equipment will notice the markings on the left-hand side along the bottom edge. There's actually some German written in there. So for pretty clear reasons, we had a substantial railway operations network going on in Germany, moving our own GIs around during the Cold War. This would have been part of that. And here we have a very, very interesting, if you built a model of it, somebody would tell you that nobody ever built a model of that. What the heck were you thinking? Definitely looks like to me like it was built on a flat car. This was definitely designed by committee. I'm sure lots of officers had their input on why don't you add this, why don't you add that, and no one could tell them no. But jerry-rigged equipment of this nature was actually pretty common, so something like this would not be unusual. Exactly, it's got a little bit of everything. So
steel bearings on the end, but wood sides.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting car. I really wish the people at the museum could have been able to tell me more about it. They said we don't know nothing about no train stuff. That's actually what they told me. So. And inside the museum is a model. If you model O scale, you could probably build something that would work like this. And if I modeled standard gauge, you better believe I would have a running version of one of these on my layout. Unfortunately, narrow gauge, you couldn't run a Jeep on it. The rails would be too close together. So what we have here is what appears to be a Ford GPW Jeep. Ford and Willis Overland both made Jeeps through World War II. And this has, I don't think these are the actual issued railroad wheels. I believe these were field expedient made ones. There's two different variants of the wheels that were actually made for them. And you could actually convert regular rims over to railroad use. I've seen photographs of 2.5-ton trucks, so the wheelbase is relatively close, where conventional wheels were actually hammered into railroad profiles. And if you notice the front of this Jeep, that's not a tow bar. You'd think that was like something to use for towing. Actually, what that's for, that was actually used for hooking two Jeeps together on conventional wheels, towing large, heavy artillery pieces, which weighed more than a single Jeep could pull. So double heading with wheeled vehicles. Yes, it did happen. But if you ever see one of these hitches on the front of it, don't let anybody ever tell you that that's a tow hitch. You could use it as one. I've used, I have a 1944 Willis MB sitting in my garage, and I borrowed one of these setups for a friend of mine to tow my Jeep behind another vehicle because I couldn't run it to an event. But they were actually designed to run 2 Jeeps together. So in this particular situation, you would run multiple Jeeps together, and you could actually pull box cars with that. And behind it, you can see he clearly has all the wheels. They have extra brackets welded to the outside of the body to be able to swap them out at a grade crossing. And here we see the front end of the same Jeep. This is on the inside of the museum at 40 Uses. This represents one being used in Burma during the Second World War. Probably the Burma-Thailand railroad, the Railroad of Death. If you've seen the movie Bridge over the River Kwai, this is the railroad that they were talking about. The reason why I know that is the sign to the immediate right refers to the Lido Road, so that's clearly the Pacific Theater. And okay, so as for myself, I wanted to model railway or a single company of a railway operating battalion on my layout. So I created a fictional one. I already operate my layout under a fictional alternate reality concept anyway, where the East Tennessee Western North Carolina Railroad had a fictional branch line where it actually didn't run in real life, taking place in 1943. So if you're going to run trains for the Army, why not go ahead and create a fictional railroad unit to run it? So I wrote a fictional history of the railroad. It was quite plausible. Of course, all units have to have an insignia. So I created this, a class 10 jumping over a stump. And no, there was never actually any kind of story behind it. It just sounded like something that a GI would come up with back in the day. I've since wrote the fictional history of the unit where I describe that the idea was a GI actually created this when an officer, when they first got to the Stony Creek Southern, took a look around and said, boys, we'll be jumping stumps for the rest of the war here. And I even went so far as to have patches made of that, even though battalion-sized units very rarely ever had patches made in the United States. Hey, it's my railroad. I'm going to do it that way anyway. And I actually had a uniform made up in an earlier slide. If you noticed it, I had one of these patches sewn on it with Transportation Corps Lieutenant Colonel's insignia on it, because my layout, my rules, my unit, my rules. And here we see outside of the headquarters of Bravo Company, 796 Railway Operating Battalion. So I made a sign with the insignia on it, mounted it on the approach as soon as you cross the railroad tracks to enter Bravo Company area. Actually, it would have been called Baker Company back in those days. And so you get an idea of the vehicles I have in mind. This is a Dodge weapons carrier, but it's called a command car. Has leather seats on it. The CO would be taken around. Probably that dirty in real life. Lieutenant Colonel and Sarge would have really given the driver grief if it sat in a motor pool like that for very long. Hard to see in the photograph because I tried to make this look like an actual 1940s picture, but I actually did all the decals for the markings for the unit as well, and painted the bumpers white. I kind of cheated on that. That way I could make my own decals and print them on my own printer. White bumpers on military vehicles in the Second World War are actually really common. That way you could see them coming at night. And this shows you a better overall look. So I have a couple of adjacent buildings to the far left out of the frame where there's a shop. There's a single spur running up next to the Quonset hut. The Quonset hut's actually a Thomas York kit that I frankly should have just used the photograph of it and scratch built the thing for all the good that the kit actually did me. I wound up scratch building most of it anyway and used only the end caps. And I've created signs that are kind of hard to read in this slide, but a sign denoting the unit. And to the right of the door, directly underneath the right window, has the name of the company commander as well as the first sergeant. Now, the company commander, I named him after my nephew, who is an Army Reserve captain. And the first sergeant's one of my best friends who's been in the hobby way longer than I have. So to the left, there is a Chevy 1.5 ton truck with a top on it. Behind that is a 2.5 ton GMC CCKW 2.5 ton. Those are models out of Eastern Europe that are really hard to find, and they did not come cheap. I spent more on those than I did a lot of my rolling stock. And I had to completely take them apart because they were both painted in, one was painted as a Ukrainian and the other painted as a Spanish Army. Neither is licensed in the United States. So you got to get them outside the United States. They're 1/43rd scale as well. And again, an attempt to show a photograph that makes it look like it could have been taken during World War II. Played around with the Quonset hut a little bit. It's a little shorter just to fit into space. A little compression selection, if you want to call it that. The figure is actually from a British manufacturer whose name escapes me right now, but I painted them up in summer weight uniforms, so they would have had worsted wool or cotton Class A's would have been worn in the United States in the summertime. At that point, they wouldn't have been wearing wool uniforms. That would come out in the wintertime. And here we have, this is kind of an anomaly. Probably wouldn't see this in real life, but hey, might lay out my rules. This is a Studebaker US 6. Not a lot of these actually got used by the United States. Most of them were given to England and the Soviet Union. But what the heck? Most of the time it faces the opposite direction. Most people don't even know what it is anyway. Only the front grille and the shape of the cab will only throw it off. Anybody in military vehicles would spot this right away, such as myself, but your average person looking at the layout would never notice. I have noticed a lot of oil drums around. Those are Tamiya 1/48 scale. And so I painted those up, weathered them pretty good. And here we have a die cast. I can't remember the manufacturer of this, but this was marked in pre-war markings where the unit markings were actually on the door. So I used some I can't think of the name of it right now. Testers makes it. It removes decals and markings. I can't think of it. It's a solvent. So, but I removed the door markings, kept the hood markings on it, put plates on the front and the back denoting a civilian vehicle, military use. And now I've got a GI sitting with his arms folded, waiting for his CO to finally get out of the Quonset hut for the 10-hour briefing he's been sitting in. So this shows you proper loading of equipment. Now, somebody might notice, hey, there's no chains, there's no ropes holding it in place. I tried that on this particular car. The problem was if it's all chained up correctly, I can't get the Jeep off of it when I do op sessions because the Jeep's supposed to be removed once it gets to where it's going. If you remember the photograph of the Jeep in the California shot earlier, you notice that the windshield is down and he's got the cover on it. Now he's got a jerry can on the back of it, but it's not being moved a long distance. This car would only be moved from Johnson City, Tennessee down to Sadie or Beuladine, which you're talking maybe 15, 20 miles. So as long as the can's empty, you don't have to worry about anybody making off with it and the rare and costly fuel inside. Now the cover for the windshield was actually a piece of tissue paper folded over, glued in place, and then brush painted with OD green model paint. It didn't take very long, but it's a really neat little detail that doesn't take much, but nobody ever thinks to model. So here we have my 1.5 ton Chevy. You notice it's a 2-axle instead of a 4-axle. It's the same cab, same front end as the GMC to the left, but you'll notice it doesn't have the what they call the Pioneer kit, the shovel and axe combination on a rack on the driver's side. Again, these are the Eastern European models. Actually, a lot of fun to take apart. The only problem is they use screws that are proprietary to Europe, so it's not standard or Phillips. It's a triangle shape embossed into the head. So I had to go buy a special set of screwdrivers just to be able to take the stupid things apart. And here we have my rendition of a Baldwin Class 10. Now, later on, I added a pile generator behind the headlight, but I think this is one of my earlier shots, so I didn't have it. So this is the one that I reviewed for O-Gauge Railroading when these locomotives first came out. It was in the first batch that Train World got. And this was actually a really neat thing for me. This thing was not cheap because it was one of the first ones. My wife was not happy I spent that much money on a locomotive. But when I got the check back from O-Gauge Railroading after the article aired, she realized, or got printed, she realized that I actually had earned more money than I had in the locomotive, the decals, and all the detail parts. So she's never given me any grief about buying anything I'm going to use in an article ever again. So this is the undecorated one. My understanding, they all sold out. Go figure. Came in basic black. What I did was I just added the numbers and put USA for U.S. Army. World War II is kind of these things were actually lettered by wherever they were actually being used. So I decided to go with something relatively easy. I put a new number plate in the front of it because the undecorated one didn't have one inside it. And I hand lettered those one number at a time without using any masking tape. I got a pretty good eye for that kind of stuff. The cab numbers really drove me nuts. I used a magnifying glass. And again, I didn't put a tape or any level or any kind of thing. I just eyeballed it, and I think it worked out pretty well. It was one of those things when I was done, I'm thinking, what the heck was I thinking? And inside, you can't really tell in this photograph. I have two GIs inside. Those are I forget the name, but they're Lionel marketed. I can't think of the name of manufacturer right now. It's not Woodland Scenics. It's the other one that anybody in the 3-rail know what I'm talking about. Williams, that's it. I believe Williams made those. It's part of a GI set. One is carrying a jerry can with his arm outstretched. I'm not sure why. The other one, I think, is supposed to be an MP. He's got a carbine in his hand, and his hand is outstretched. So what I found out was I could stuff them into the cap. I mean, they barely fit inside. I didn't have to glue them in place. They're literally wedged inside. So the rifle is pointing towards the back head, and the jerry can is pointing towards the back head, and you see the hands outstretched to the controls, almost as if I intended it to be that way. So I didn't even have to modify the figures other than repainting them because they were painted kind of oddly. Here is side view. Okay, this shows you better the figure. I actually took the figure out. Even the leggings I took out with a magnifying glass and actually put the grommets for the leggings where the laces hold it in place, as well as the snaps and the U.S. markings on the canteen. You can barely see he's holding on to an M1 carbine in the photograph if you look very carefully. But again, this is later on. You can see the pile generator is now in place behind the stack. I couldn't fit it behind the headlight. You can see that it just wasn't enough room. I wanted to match the one at Fort Benning, but I couldn't quite do that. And I put a little chalk markings when the last time the tanks were drained, a little bigger than they would have been in real life, but at least people can read them. But this is where you can have fun with this kind of stuff because these things were basically marked with however the unit decided to mark them. So you can put quartermaster markings on it, transportation corps, or just put regular road number on it, whatever you want to do with it. And here we have, God help me, a diseasel. And so when Botman came out with the Whitcomb 50-tonners, I found out that these locomotives did exist, and they were used by the U.S. Army, although I've not found a photograph of the narrow gauge version of these actually being used. It's kind of a stretch, I'll give you, but I used the undecorated. Well, they were all undecorated except for one, and this is how one of them came. Actually, came in yellow with safety stripes, which they did have some locomotives in World War II were marked that way. So I made my own decals. Can't really tell on the left says Transportation Corps, to the right says U.S. Army. I put a locomotive number on the side. There's a locomotive number on the front, and slightly out of focus, it says air brakes were tested at Camp Holabird, Maryland, which is where the very first Jeeps were tested before the war. And I even put 796 ROB, 796 Railway Operating Battalion is actually marked on the cab in the lower right-hand corner, as well as putting a Whitcomb builder's plate on them, which Botman, for some bizarre reason, didn't put them on there. And I stuck a GI figure in the cab as well. Okay, so that was a very, very fast explanation as a wonderful world of Army equipment. That's pretty much it. Of course, this subject is a much bigger topic than this. I could write an entire book on it, although I'm just lazy and I don't intend to do so. But that kind of gives you an idea of the things you can do. Basically, a narrow gauge, standard gauge, any era of that nature. So if anybody's still awake, I'll be happy to entertain questions at this point.
So if you're out there, you'll have to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, I got it. I have a question. A couple of times you referenced the military or the Army way. Was the difference between, let's say, the commercial railroads and the Army? Is there anything that caused you to make that distinction?
Well, yeah, quite a few, because civilian railroads run very different from the military in just that
Example.
capacity. But simple things like hand signals, for example, the signal for a lot of Army hand signals used by the military, especially for, say, for the infantry, were actually the exact opposite for what the railroads actually used. So these guys would actually go through basic training. So they might be told that there was one particular hand signal which was hurry up in the railroad world actually meant stop. So so they had to learn those things. They had to learn to become soldiers because, you know, if they ever like overrun or attacked or something like that, they had to learn how to defend themselves with proper.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So a couple of times in my life, I've gotten real deep into this subject and collecting a lot of HO scale military equipment. But the one thing I could never find was what you'd call a loading list for a given, you know, troop unit. How many of each kind of vehicle should fit on each flight car in the military train, the way a circus train would have a loading list. I've never found anything.
And you're not going to. The reason why is that actually varied from unit to unit. So, and also, unlike a circus train, one train wouldn't move an entire unit. So a good example was, in my own experience, I was a ordnance officer in the United States Army. I actually did a lot of rail loading of equipment. So, see, my last unit was a heavy mechanized unit. We transitioned over to the very first Stryker Brigade the Army had. But we would move tanks. We had M1 tanks, M2 Bradley fighting vehicles, and then a bunch of ancillary wheeled vehicles of all different types. You wouldn't move everything all at once. You couldn't possibly put an entire brigade of M1 tanks, for example, on flat cars. And you certainly couldn't put Stewart or Sherman tanks. You couldn't move an entire unit all in one train. So what you would do is you would break it down however the unit commander decided to do it. So maybe they would move one battalion, all of their vehicles at one time, or they would kind of scatter it around, which is more than likely what they would do. A sane, rational Army commander, certainly did in my time, we would put a little bit of everybody's units in the brigade. The key vehicles you would want on the ground immediately once you got where you were going. You would want to have all that stuff in place right away. And so the follow-up trains would be vehicles you don't really need right away. Although most of the stuff would show up within about a day or two anyway. You'd have all the soldiers already out for the offload of vehicles at the railhead. And normally you do that all at one time. It would take at least a day or two. But you're not going to find a standard list of that kind of stuff because your unit could be a field artillery unit moving field pieces and wheeled vehicles. You could be an armored unit moving a lot of tanks around, which had support vehicles, and then you have infantry units in support of those vehicles. So you'd have half tracks, 2.5 tons, 3/4 ton weapons carriers, things of that nature. There's a lot of vehicles, so you'd have a whole bunch of trains. So it would really be up to the planning, what we refer to as the S3, which is a segment of planning, a segment of an Army staff that actually handles that kind of thing. They'd be responsible for that kind of stuff. Now, they would have a load guide. Obviously, you're not going to overload the car. So big giant shocker, there's manuals for that kind of stuff. There was in the 40s. There was in my time. I stole all my copies. I still have them. And but it would show you, how you load a railroad car. Now, loading heavy equipment on a railroad car is not as important as, let's say, an airplane. That's a really big deal. That's a whole different subject to itself, where you center of balance and things of that nature. But you wouldn't want to put like a 70-ton Abrams tank on the back end of a car and put nothing on the front end of it. That can't possibly be good. I'm sure that might mess up the car. So you'd go by the guides on how to do all that stuff. And the funny thing is, you'd always load all the vehicles, if you had any sanity to you whatsoever, all the vehicles facing in the same direction, because what would happen is you get the railhead, you'd want the railroad to actually put it to the end of the ramp And you could actually drive, if they did it right, you could actually drive all the way from the very back end of the train to the front end of the train. You could do that in the 40s, you do that now. But yeah, you're not going to find a standardized load. I wish there was such a thing, but you're not going to see it. And if you look at photographs and film of that time period, you're going to see a different way that they did everything back then too.
Yeah. I was able to find military documents listing all the people and equipment in all the various kinds of units they had, which is really helpful.
Yeah, it's a table of organizational equipment. That's easy to find. It also breaks down the kind of vehicles a unit would have, but unfortunately for us, it doesn't really tell you exactly how they would be shipped. But yeah, no, breaking down in any unit, however many people, all you have to do is find a TO&E for it, and it'll tell you exactly how many people. I got all the documents. I think the FM 2-5. 55-55, whichever one for the Railway Operating Battalion has an organizational chart that tells you absolutely every single place. And the really neat thing about that manual is it actually tells you what the civilian equivalent of it is. So if you only understand train, like you know what a divisional person is in a railroad, you know what the conductor is, you know what the positions on a railroad are. Well, the great thing is the breakdown of it. The graph in there, it actually tells you what the Army is, what the Army designation of that job is, and then what the civilian designation of it is.
You mentioned the security, those machine guns on the tanks. They're being easily thrown overboard and retrieved by bad people. Well, what is there's not a GI on every flat car, is there?
No, God, no.
Okay, what is the security?
Okay, well,
just guys in the rider caboose?
In the 40s, what they would do is they would have GIs in passenger cars normally. There would be at least a couple of passenger cars on it. That way you could have people keeping an eye out. And when a train stops, like that photograph that I showed where the guy's sitting in the Jeep, God knows how long that train was probably sitting there. Sarge probably said, hey, you and you get out, go look at the train. Well, that GI was smart. He's like, I'm not going to stand around. I'm going to sit in the Jeep. Although, trust me on this, sitting in the driver's seat of a World War II Jeep is no comfortable thing.
Yeah.
Trust me, take my word for it. I've done it a lot. But that kind of gives you an idea. Now, the weapons would normally be in modern times, they would actually be in a 20-foot Connex box. The little square boxes with the open doors. If you ever see a train with equipment and you see a flat car will have like 3 or 4 of those, that's your night vision gear, that's your computers, that's your crew serve weapons, the machine guns, the things that the individual GIs or soldiers are not going to be getting on the plane with. I probably shouldn't tell you that, but that's what it is. And during World War II, they would probably be housed in a car with soldiers. Because now you have like GPS mounted on all these things. So if the train stops from it, they'll know exactly where it is at all times. So heck, you could even like watch it with a satellite or something like that if you really wanted to. But back then you'd have some guys with it, but the stuff would be all locked away.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So you're saying, go ahead.
I have a question, and that is, I know you showed the Jeep with the canvas over the windshield. Do they ever, or do they nowadays, or I'm modeling 1970s Vietnam era. Do they ever ship it with the canvas on, like the Deuce and a Half with the canvas on the back?
Not if you're smart. The reason why they put tops on World War II Jeeps is the front of the windshield is actually, well, you've seen the photographs of Jeeps, where they pivot. The basically 2 pipes pretty much running down the side of the frame actually curved in arcs that actually meet 2 pivots on the side of the body where you can actually pull the windshield forward, rotate it. That's actually pretty fragile. Like if you jumped on the hood of a World War II Jeep and kicked to the very top of the windshield, you'd bend that. So imagine what a canvas top whipping around at 60 miles an hour, mainline speeds or something like that, being pulled against that thing. That's the reason why they didn't have them with the windshields up. Now, the vehicles you're talking about would be M151s, what they call the Ford Mutts. A very similar looking vehicle, much lower to the ground, a little wider. Externally, kind of looks very kind of similar to a World War II Jeep. I think probably in that time frame, you'd more than likely see the windshields down on those as well, and the canvas tops not on them, because all the whipping around at a mainline speed. Probably, I mean, M15 ones were notorious for rolling over, so people didn't drive them very fast. I'm sure going mainline speeds, it probably would tear the canvas right off of it. And again, do you want to answer to Sarge where you get where you're going, where the canvas is gone? Because you signed for that. So there's a reason why in that one photograph where the GI is sitting in the Jeep, that everything's stripped out of the Jeep. Somebody signed for that stuff. So I
would that be true then too of deuce and a halves or anything else with canvas? The canvas would be off.
More than likely, yeah. Now I have seen the modern versions of those, the 1900 series 5 tons that they use today. I have seen canvas tops on those and Humvees, but those tops are made out of rubberized canvas. They're much more sturdily made than the treated canvas of the time frame you're talking about and the time frame that I model. The canvas would have been very similar. That really nasty, stinky mildew protection.
Yeah, right. The oiled.
In that time frame knows exactly what that smell. You never forget that. But I'd say, other than modern time, probably modeling all the canvas tops on a vehicle probably would not be prototypically correct. That's not to say that tomorrow you might find photographs of it. I'm sure you could. I actually recently found movie film of a train at the beginning of World War II passing through Tenino. I found it on YouTube. And the Jeeps did have tops on them. And I was really surprised by that. So much so I actually took stills of it and actually shared it with a Jeep forum, where everyone responded like, wow, I never would have thought I'd see that. That is the only documentation I've ever seen of vehicles Jeeps being moved. And I bet you those Jeeps were never moved with the tops on again after that. They probably kept the windshield frames and probably screwed the tops up. But the rambling answer to your question is, I wouldn't think it would be less likely to see them with the tops on than off. But hey, your layout, your rules. You can say that Sarge demanded that the tops stay on.
Well, sometimes hard and N scale to get the vehicles without the canvas, so you're stuck.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's funny. I was running on Tyler Whitcomb's Tenino Western not too long ago. He has some GMC CCKWs in N scale. I was really surprised to find those. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's N scale like M35 series out there somewhere.
Oh, I got the whole fleet of stuff, yeah. And TO needs to match. So I've kind of built different units: artillery, mechanized infantry, engineers,
M113, things like that. Yeah. Oh yeah. But bottom line, I'm sure you'd find some kind of prototype of it actually being done. I'm positive we'll find a photograph somewhere, but I'm just saying that canvas is actually very similar to the World War II stuff. Certainly on the M15 ones, I would not expect you to see, although they were secured much better than World War II Jeeps. If you ever see one somewhere, restored somewhere, take a really good look. I mean, they're only held by 5 straps, I believe it is, across the back, and some rivets and grommets in the front. That's it. And two canvas straps holding the top bow to keep the top of it up. It doesn't take much to yank the top off one of them suckers. So the 151s, though, they're actually held in much better than that. They were better secured, but that's that same treated canvas. So if it were me, I would model them like that. But your point's well taken, and I do understand where you're coming from with your deuce and a half stuff.
I got another question, if I could. Let's say I'm modeling a military train that's moving from one fort to another across the U.S. During the Korean War. And did you say that besides all the flat cars full of equipment, there would be 1 or 2 passenger cars for the officers or the men in the unit? And if so, would there also be a caboose at the end?
That would vary from train to train. I've seen lots of that Korean War stuff. I don't profess to be that big of an expert on, because there's just not a lot written about that kind of stuff. But that said, yeah, what I would expect to be something similar, because you got to remember all the NCOs and officers in the Korean War had all served in World War II. So I would expect to see something very similar, and most the same kind of vehicles. You'd see World War II era MBs, GPWs, Jeeps. You'd see CCKWs, the late war ones without the hard cabs, unlike the ones I model. Late war.
And some trains would be all passenger cars, and if so, would they have a host railroad caboose on the end?
I wouldn't. If it were me, I'd probably say probably not. You would need a caboose on something like that. The movie film that I've seen of complete troop trains in World War II, especially, there would be a bunch of equipment moving around, and you'd either have the passenger cars either at one end or the other, or split. I've seen there's a DVD with a little color movie film called Glory Machines. If you ever get the opportunity, it's an amazing film, like film from all over the country, almost all in color. And they got a really good shot of a troop train going by, and it's a whole bunch of long gondolas. They must have craned all the equipment. It's early war. They must have craned all the equipment inside the gondolas. You barely see like the tops of the vehicles as it's going by. But it has a bunch of passenger cars in the back. And I don't remember seeing a caboose. I don't remember seeing cabooses on any. Now, the one black and white photograph I have where the guy's sitting in the Jeep, I bet you that train's probably got a caboose at the back end of it. He might even have passenger cars at the front end as well. So if you really want to put a caboose on this, here's what I do. I'd put one or two passenger cars in the front, bunch of flat cars with wheeled vehicles on it and artillery pieces, whatever you want to put, slap a caboose on the back end of it.
Okay, thank you.
When I haul my John Deere around on my trailer, which is similar to a Jeep on a flat car, you have chain or come along attach points, left front, left rear, right rear. If you run those chains straight ahead and straight back, you're wasting your time.
Yeah.
That'll keep the vehicle from going forward, backward, but it will not keep it from falling off the side of the trailer. You've got to cross those chains both ways.
Yeah.
And just depending on the mood the state patrol is in, if he decides to take exception to it and he's not paid for lunch, you're looking at $180 fine. On every one of the slides I saw, the change went straight forward.
Yeah.
They weren't crossed. What's going on there?
That's just how they did it back then. Matter of fact, Jeeps in World War II didn't have an attachment point for that kind of thing. So you would actually run it
through the bumper somewhere.
Yeah, I kind of hard. I'm trying to think how to explain this to somebody not familiar with it.
Because that's what I do with my John Deere.
Yeah, you'd run it.
Attachment point. You wrap it around.
Yeah, you'd run it. You run a chain. How I do it is you'd run a chain or strap. Now it would be a tow strap, but they would run chains under the bumper where the leaf springs come up to meet the front of the frame horns. There's a C-shaped piece that holds the bottom end of it, holds the front of the leaf spring in, and the top's connected to it. So you run the chain through that opening. So you run it behind the opening and through the open end of the C, and that connects up down to each end. The back end has a tow pintle on the back of it. So you just open that sucker up and run your chain or strap through that and close the tow pintle on it. That's the easy part. The front ends, it took me forever to figure out how to strap my Jeep down, because even the World War II railroad loading guides don't actually go into that kind of detail. Now, tracked vehicles all had tow hooks, front and aft.
Yeah, but they need to front.
Yeah, but they didn't. I get your point. Now, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that it just wasn't done very often.
A horse trailer for 50 years, and you got two chains coming off your hip back to the vehicle. You don't cross those chains, it's $180 if that cop feels like stopping you.
And I've never heard of that.
Of course, if you come off the hitch and your trailer's going like that, you want those chains crossed to keep it from doing that. Otherwise, if they're just straight back, well, it'll keep you close to the tow vehicle, but it isn't going to prevent this. You got to cross those chains.
Yeah.
That's the code.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's the Army way, and then there's the.
Did you ever do any studying on the Brooklyn Army Terminal car floats? That was very interesting. They would bring cars over on barges from the Jersey side, and the Brooklyn Army Terminal was quite a logistical center. Did you ever do anything on that?
Not the car floats, but I'm familiar with I can't think of maybe it's Brooklyn as well. There's a I can't even think of the name of it, but it was a large structure that the railroad actually came through the center of it. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. I was doing some reading about that recently, and that was a lot of the men that were killed in the Second World War in Europe were actually brought back to the United States and actually brought in. Giant, tall, massive building, and the railroad tracks run right through the center. My understanding, the building's still there. But as the car floats, I got to be honest with you, this topic is way too big to be familiar with every aspect of it. You can spend a long life reading about every aspect of military railroad operations. Trust
How about the 10-ton locomotive? Were they diesel hydraulic?
Now, which kind?
10-ton.
The 10-ton locomotive, little, small.
They had all kinds of stuff like that. Multiple manufacturers, Plymouth, Whitcomb, several companies made 2 and 4 axle diesel electrics. In World War I, they had gas mechanical locomotives. I can't think of the manufacturers right now. Tiny little suckers, usually 2 axles, much smaller than the small steam locomotives. Like I said earlier, they use those things to along the trench lines. That way, the Germans wouldn't see the smoke of the locomotive coming up and decide to figure out if they got the range right, taking pot shots at it, which they would with steam engines. So that goes back much further than you think. The idea of using a non-steam locomotive in 1917 kind of blows people away when they're put. But they had all kinds of stuff like that, and they use diesels, of course, in munitions plants. Anything you wouldn't want a steam locomotive. So an ordnance depot, especially a place where they would have explosives, you wouldn't want. Now, military explosives aren't subject to fire going off quite so easily, like a dynamite factory or something like that. Military doesn't use. Well, they actually do use dynamite, but conventional military explosives for cratering charges, engineering use, and then the explosives used in munitions themselves wouldn't just go off in close proximity to a steamboat. Like a single ember isn't going to set something like that off. Most of the stuff is composite explosives, but they would use a lot of diesels in those scenarios. They sold all kinds of. The manufacturer sold all kinds of diesel electrics to the military. Matter of fact, I have a builder's plate off of an Army S2, Alco S2, built in 1942. There's plenty of that stuff still around. But for a specific class, I wouldn't have the details on, but just a few.
Got a few comments that came in. So 2-foot gauge is equal to 605 millimeters. And meter gauge is about 3 foot 3 inches between the rails. So thank you for a very interesting presentation, and you should consider writing that book. So you've been challenged now.
Well, I wrote a little bit. I wrote an article on it. That's because it's going to get.
Start for your book. Great presentation. Thanks. I just lost it.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Yep, I got some thanks, please. The first let's see. I have a photo of an S-160 in gray. You can share it if you wish. Looks like the chat didn't go to Lee, so we'll make sure if you want that. That's from John Garrity.
Okay.
First diesel mechanicals in World War I were used in 1916. And also had a narrow gauge petrol electric by Dick Kerr, which was a UK builder. That's the stuff that was in the chat.
Right. And I didn't even go into Allied use because the Brits did the same thing. I mean, they had plenty of locomotives they sent to export. And they did the same thing. They had Army railroaders. As a matter of fact, the British had a training railroad as late as the 1960s, a place called Longmoor. And Google that. That's actually really cool. They were running steam engines well into the 1960s. They were doing like public events and things like that. And it's all abandoned now. But oh yeah, it wasn't just the Americans, and the British actually did. they definitely did their fair share of doing the same thing that we did. But obviously, our industrial base allowed us to provide a lot more equipment than they could.
One of the steam locos from the Longmoor Museum is now in the Utrecht Railway Museum in the Netherlands.
I've seen that. No, I know exactly. Yeah, it's actually Longmoor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a 210 and big and blue.
Yeah, it's got a special plate over the Longmoor. It says like 10,000th or whatever. It's something like this is the something if locomotive sent to Europe or something like that. I've actually been to. I was 18, but I'll never forget that. I found it's funny you'd say that because I found the photographs of that not too long ago.
I've also got photos of that loco at Utrecht. If you want me to bring that one up.
So John, thanks for your input. If you want to send me an email, I'll make sure Lee has your contact information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lee and I have been kind of swapping stuff off list between ourselves for a little while.
I'm about to say, yeah, John, I'm kind of sorry. After a while, when you're doing something like this, you kind of forget too much information to throw out and catch at the same time. Ah, yes, yeah. There's a bunch of John. There's a bunch. That's the Zalgoda book, I think, if I remember correctly. There's a bunch of really good books on armored trains. I could have made an entire presentation on that. The U.S. didn't really get into that much. That was more a European kind of thing, although it was done everywhere. But we never fielded any armored trains that I'm aware of, except maybe a couple of captured German ones. But yeah, you could make an entire lifetime hobby out of just studying that alone. That's a really you got things like railway artillery and a whole bunch of other stuff. Like I said, this is way too big of a topic to cover this in a little over an hour.
What's you said, but I forgot. What is your actual area? Is it Korean or World War II or?
My layout takes place in 1943, so it's the height of World War II.
Yeah, okay.
So
would it be prototypical to put 2 tanks on a 40-foot flat car?
No.
One per?
Yeah, way too heavy. Yeah, I don't know what the load capacity for a 40-foot flat is, but a Sherman tank weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25 to 30 tons or something like that. I mean, they ain't light. I know for sure that an M1 tank weighs about somewhere between 60 and 70 tons. It depends on whether it's loaded.
World War II train would have probably one Sherman per flat car.
More than likely, yeah. Now, they had longer flat cars. I have seen photographs of a Sherman like on each end of a much longer flat car.
50 foot.
Yeah, you're stretching, but I know for sure that I've seen pictures of that.
Okay.
The problem is a lot of these books and stuff. There's several books on the subject, but they're scattered. They a lot of times the authors and the editors don't know what era.
Yeah.
So you'll see pictures from like the Fort Eustis Railroad in the 1960s. And they'll say it's from World War II, and I look at it like, the guy's wearing a Vietnam era uniform. I mean, if you're into stuff like I am, you immediately pick up on it. Or you notice the markings are wrong. Like you can tell that the grab irons are yellow on it. And I know for sure you're not going to find a World War II era. So you have Korean War used a lot of World War II equipment. So you might have a Korean War train actually being presented as World War II. So you really got to be on top of what you're looking at. And a lot of times you're not going to. That's
movies are the same way. There's Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe on a train, and they show a picture of it, and it's some little 040 in New Zealand.
Yeah. The 50-ton Whitcomb ON30. There were actually 3 of them built, and they went to Hawaii. They had a 30-inch gauge railway near Pearl Harbor that they serviced. There's photos. I've seen photos of them loaded on the flat cars being transported across the US before they left. So the 50-ton Whitcomb on 30-inch gauge did actually exist.
Of course, I'm cheating on that. I'm representing a 3-foot gauge, but of course it's ON30. You know.
Hey, I'll crib you 6 inches.
Also, I'm lazy, and when I got back into the hobby, I knew I wasn't going to be able to re-gauge the stuff without screwing it up real bad. So I said, "Oh, fine, I'll go with the ON30." But I knew that they existed. But thanks for the info, John, because I never really did a lot of research into like where they went or anything like that. It'd be neat to see a picture of one of them. Now that I'm thinking about it, doesn't one still, is that the one that they still have at the?
There's one of them that still exists in Hawaii somewhere.
I've actually seen that one. I didn't realize that that was one of the, I figured it had to be one of the Navy ones that they had, but I didn't realize that was it. So
yeah, talk to Neil Erickson about that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Neil would be a great guy to ask about that. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions?
Anyone want a quick look at that S160?
Oh, sure. If you could
Yeah,
show
go
it.
for it.
But he's fighting to get away, so do it.
Amazingly.
Can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay, that is currently in service on the Keighley and Worth Valley in the UK. The S160 was built, or that S160 was the European ones were built to tighter clearances than standard US. They're about 3 foot narrower and about probably another 3 foot lower than standard US S160s that came out of the one factory. All the running gear is exactly the same. The boiler is exactly the same. So it's all done with varying the tender width and the cab width. But basically, there's a standard S160 still in current service. That photo is 2018.
I know there's at least a couple of them because I've seen videos of, I don't know which railroad it is, but one of those tourist railroads actually has like a couple of them running on. Now, John, have you heard, I'm guessing you probably heard that they blew up a few of the British crews blew up at least 2 of those things before D-Day.
I wouldn't be surprised.
They only,
the standard UK setup is 2 gauge glasses.
Yeah, exactly.
With 0 tricox.
Mm-hmm.
Tricox were unknown on UK boilers from probably about the 1900s on. It was always dual gauge glasses. And yeah, if you have trouble on your gauge glass and you don't know it, you can go low water and launch a boiler.
Yep.
When you launch the boiler, that takes out the crew on the footplate and anyone else around it, probably within 100 feet.
Yep.
A lot of people don't give steam locos the credit for being the mobile bombs that they can turn into if they're not managed correctly.
Yeah, and the British crews wouldn't touch the things for a little bit too until they had to be refamiliarized with them. I actually have some. I got that. I can't think of who wrote it. Somebody wrote a pretty decent book on the S160s, and they talk about that. I got it recently from Amazon. I think it was written like in the 70s or 80s, and whoever wrote it actually had a hand in restoring one of those for one of those tourist. It's the one that they did in the movie Yanks. I don't know if anybody.
Yep. And for memory, that may well have been the loco that starred.
Yeah. And it's actually that they don't run it in the scene. When they all pull down to the port of embarkation, it's just sitting there for all of about 20 seconds, and you blink if you missed it. It's in the background. I always thought that was the neatest detail in that whole movie was they included no, it's actually not a bad movie for its authenticity. It's kind of a weird script, but the authenticity for a movie in the 1970s, they did a pretty good job. But yeah, that blew me away when they all go down to the port of, they go down to the train yard to get on the trains to go down to port of embarkation, and there's that S160 sitting there in really nice, authentic U.S. Army markings. But yeah, the gray markings on that locomotive were actually, yeah, they did paint them like that. Most of them were black, but I'm not sure what the rhyme or reason was behind painting some of them gray. I never understood that.
Neither did I. That loco is also running tender first. So yes, you can have a 10 couple locomotive like that. Hang on, is it a 280? I think they're 280s, aren't they?
Yeah.
S160s.
Yeah. Okay,
you can have an 8 couple loco like that and run it tail end first.
Yeah.
And get away with it because it's prototype operation, and run it. The Keighley Worth Valley is only about 4 mile, but it's got a few significant ups and downs on it. So yeah, these locos earn their keep on this particular tourist railway. For anyone who doesn't know, Keithley and Worth Valley is also the Railway Children railway where they shot it.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I'll stop sharing and go back to lurking.
Well,
Thank
thanks,
you, John.
Yeah.